A lonely mechanic fixes a poor wheelchair girl's chair on the street. She says, crying, "Nobody has ever done anything for me. Thank you, sir." And he answers, "I'm just trying to be a better person every day." But when a young billionaire sees it all, he's shocked to recognize who the mechanic is. Calvin opened his eyes even before the alarm rang. It was always like that. His body, so used to routine, no longer needed alarms. He lay there for a few minutes, feeling the familiar aches in his back and knees. That narrow bed in the makeshift room at the back of the shop didn't help much. "Come on, old man," he muttered to himself as he got up with effort. The small window let in the dim morning light. Outside, the city was still waking up. Calvin put on his faded blue coveralls and slipped on his worn boots. In the cracked bathroom mirror, he saw the face time hadn't spared. Deep wrinkles, thinning white hair, permanent dark circles. His eyes, however, were still an intense blue, even if they always seemed tired now. "Another day," he said to his reflection, as though making a promise. In the improvised kitchen, he brewed strong coffee and nibbled on a piece of yesterday's bread. He ate out of necessity, not pleasure. His movements were mechanical, as though his body were on autopilot. The old radio played songs from another era. Calvin hadn't changed the station in years. At exactly 6:30 Ds, he walked down the small hallway connecting his little room to the workshop. The smell of oil, metal, and rubber greeted him like an old friend. This was his world, where he knew exactly what to do, where every tool had its place. Calvin's auto repair had been there for over 30 years, surviving the city's modernization and the big dealership networks that sprang up over time. Calvin switched on the lights, lifted the metal front door, and put up the "open" sign. The first customer wouldn't arrive for another hour, a gentleman who wanted to change the oil in his old car. Just enough time to organize the day. While arranging the tools on the workbench, his hands stopped. There it was, as always, the time-worn photo, protected by a simple metal frame. A boy of about 6 smiled, holding a toy car. In the background, an amusement park. The boy's smile was almost identical to Calvin's when he was young. Same blue eyes, the same light brown hair. "Good morning, Garrett," Calvin said quietly, as he did every morning. His rough, calloused fingers lightly touched the photograph. 28 years. That was how long it had been since he'd seen his son. 28 missed birthdays, 28 Christmases, graduations, achievements, failures, a whole life he hadn't witnessed. Calvin closed his eyes for a moment. Memories came without warning. The last argument with Nora, the suitcases packed by the door, little Garrett crying, asking where his dad was going. "I'll be back soon, champ." A promise never kept. Regret was his most loyal companion. It arrived every morning with his coffee, stayed with him throughout the workday, and lay down with him at night. In the first few years after leaving, he sent letters, tried to make contact, never got a response. Over time, shame kept him from trying anymore. How do you ask forgiveness for breaking a family? How do you explain you ran away not out of lack of love, but out of fear of failing, of not being the father and husband they deserved? The clock on the wall read 7 o'clock when Calvin put the photo back in the drawer. His eyes were moist, but he didn't actually cry. Men of his generation rarely allowed themselves that. The sound of an approaching engine signaled the arrival of the first customer. Calvin took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. His body hurt, but he could still work. It was all he had. "Good morning, Mr. Parsons," he greeted as he saw the gray-haired man get out of the old car. "Punctual as always." "The day I'm not punctual, Calvin, you can look for me in the cemetery," joked the customer, who was probably about the same age as Calvin. They both laughed, and for a moment the weight in Calvin's chest lifted slightly. That was how his days went, alternating between painful memories and small, graceful moments, between solitude and the brief connections with regular customers, between regret over the past and simple survival in the present. As he opened the car's hood, Calvin noticed his hands trembling. It was happening more often. Age was catching up, his body protesting. He knew he couldn't go on like this much longer. The shop, his only source of income, demanded strength and precision he felt slipping away day by day. "You all right there, Calvin?" Mr. Parsons asked, noticing his hesitation. All good, he replied with a forced smile. Just thinking which tool to use. But it wasn't true. Calvin was thinking about how much time he had left before his body completely betrayed him. He wondered what the end would look like, alone in that little room at the back of the shop. He wondered about Garrett, who by now must be a grown man. Did he have children? Was he a better father than Calvin had been? The morning dragged on slowly. Calvin worked in silence, his hands performing motions they knew by heart. The radio kept playing old tunes. The picture of the smiling little boy waited in the drawer like a broken promise, a constant reminder that some simple things, when lost, leave a silence that lasts forever. The morning had been quiet. Calvin was closing the shop for lunch when he heard a metallic noise followed by muffled crying. He looked outside and saw, a few yards from the entrance, a small wheelchair tipped over on the sidewalk. Next to it, a girl was trying to get up, her face contorted with frustration. "Need help?" Calvin asked, approaching slowly. The girl looked up, startled. She had brown hair in a messy braid and big green eyes, now red from crying. She wore an oversized coat and fingerless gloves. "I don't need anything," she replied, struggling in vain to lift the chair. "I can handle this on my own." Calvin stopped a few steps away, respecting the child's space. He noticed that one of the wheelchair's wheels was crooked, spokes broken. "Your chair's broken," he said calmly. "I'm a mechanic. I can take a look at it if you'd like." The girl stared at him distrustfully, as though calculating the risks of trusting a stranger. "I don't have money to pay," she finally said, wiping her tears with her coat sleeve. Calvin smiled kindly. "I'm not charging anything." He moved closer, crouched by the chair and examined it. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated before answering. "Ellie." "Nice to meet you, Ellie. I'm Calvin. This chair can be fixed quickly. I just need to take it to my shop over there," he said, pointing to the faded sign, Calvin's Auto Repair. Ellie still looked reluctant, but another glance at the broken wheel made her sigh. "Okay," she agreed at last, "but I'm going with you. And if you try anything weird, I'll scream so loud everyone will hear." Calvin nodded, hiding a smile. "Deal. Can I carry you over there?" After another moment of hesitation, Ellie agreed. Calvin picked her up carefully, surprised at how light she was, as if she hadn't eaten well for days. With his other hand, he dragged the damaged chair. Inside the shop, Calvin placed Ellie on a cushioned chair, the only one without grease stains. She watched his every movement with sharp eyes, like a little guard on high alert. "Where are your parents?" Calvin asked as he worked on the wheel. Ellie looked at the floor. "Around." Calvin understood and didn't push. Instead, he began explaining what he was doing with the chair, naming each tool and showing her how the wheel's spokes fit together. To his surprise, Ellie leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Do you fix cars too?" she asked, looking around the shop. "That's what I've been doing for almost 40 years, Calvin replied. "Is it harder to fix a car or a wheelchair? Depends on the damage. But the principle is the same. Understand how things work and where the problem is." While working, Calvin noticed Ellie eyeing a sandwich wrapped in paper on the workbench, his lunch for the day. "You hungry?" he asked. Ellie looked away, embarrassed, but her stomach answered with a loud growl. She laughed, a light and unexpectedly bright sound that made Calvin smile too. "I've got an extra sandwich," he lied, splitting his own lunch in half. "I won't manage to eat it all anyway." Ellie took the food and devoured it quickly, confirming Calvin's suspicion that she hadn't eaten in a while. "All set," he said after tightening the wheel's last spoke. "Let's test it." Calvin helped Ellie back into the chair. She rolled forward and backward, then turned in a circle, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "It's perfect. Better than before," she exclaimed. Calvin felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. It was different from how he felt fixing cars. There was something about the child's sincere gratitude that touched him deeply. "Why did you help me?" Ellie asked suddenly, her gaze serious again. "Nobody ever helps unless they want something in return." Calvin thought for a moment. "I'm just trying to be a better person every day." The words came out unplanned, but as soon as he said them, he realized how true they were. Each small act of kindness was his attempt to make up for past mistakes, for having abandoned his own son. Ellie studied him with those big green eyes, as though she could see right through him. "You look sad," she observed with a child's frankness. Calvin was taken aback. "Everybody gets sad sometimes," he answered gently. "I do too," said Ellie. "Especially when I'm alone." The girl's words struck something within Calvin. Suddenly, he saw himself in that lonely child, and now, for a brief moment, he felt less alone. Across the street, inside a black Mercedes-Benz stopped at the red light, Garrett Foster watched the scene through the window. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his Rolex discreetly shimmering on his wrist. At 34, he was one of the youngest billionaires in the country, having founded a tech company that revolutionized the financial market. But at that moment, he wasn't the powerful CEO sitting in that car. He was just a 6-year-old boy again, seeing his father for what felt like the first time in almost 3 decades. "Sir, are you all right?" asked his driver, noticing his sudden pallor. Garrett didn't reply. He couldn't take his eyes off the old mechanic helping the wheelchair girl. That kind smile, those blue eyes, he would recognize them anywhere, despite all the changes time had imposed. "Calvin," he whispered to himself, his father's name slipping from his lips like a long-kept secret. Seeing his father being kind to some stranger's child stirred a whirlwind of emotions inside him. Anger came first, raw and familiar. How could this man who left him, who made his mother cry endless nights, stand there helping some random kid with such tenderness? Where was that compassion when his own son needed him? The light turned green, but Garrett didn't move. "Circle the block," he ordered the driver, slowly. As the car went around the area, Garrett kept watching. He saw his father laugh genuinely at something the girl said. He saw how easily they talked, as if they were old friends rather than strangers who had just met. A bitter confusion mixed with the anger. It was unfair. That child was getting the kindness he should have had. Memories of waiting for his dad to come home, of asking his mother over and over when he would return, surged with renewed force. "Pull over," he said abruptly. The driver complied, stopping a few yards from the shop. Garrett continued watching, unable to look away, torn between the urge to get out and confront the man who abandoned him, and the fear of what that confrontation might unleash. He saw his father help the girl leave the shop, her wheelchair apparently fixed. They chatted casually, the girl gesturing as she spoke, Calvin nodding and smiling. A knot formed in Garrett's throat. What right did Calvin have to smile like that, to look so at peace after everything he'd done? "Let's go," Garrett finally said, his voice cold and controlled, masking the storm within. As the car pulled away, Garrett grabbed his phone and typed a quick message to his assistant. "I need information on Calvin Foster, auto repair shop at 247 Maple Avenue. Everything you can find. Top priority." After sending the message, Garrett looked back through the rear window one last time. His father was still there, a small, aging figure on the sidewalk, waving at the girl as she rolled away in her wheelchair. The image burned itself into his mind. His father, the man who left him, finding time to fix a stranger's chair and share his lunch with her. Garrett clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. The pain of abandonment, which he thought he'd overcome years ago, came flooding back in full force, now mixed with a disturbing confusion. How could the man who abandoned his own son be the same man who extended a hand to help a random child? Garrett entered his Manhattan penthouse and loosened his tie. The city lights glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed the multi-million-dollar view. His mind was still on the image of his father, older, more stooped but unmistakable, helping that girl in the wheelchair. He poured himself an expensive whiskey and walked to the wall where he kept his family photos, few but significant. His eyes landed on one in particular. He was 5 years old, sitting on his mother's lap. Nora smiled bravely for the camera, but Garrett always noticed the shadow of sadness in her eyes. That photo was taken just months after Calvin left them. His phone vibrated. A message from his assistant. "Preliminary report on Calvin Foster in your email." Garrett opened his laptop and read the file. The information was sparse, but enough to confirm what he suspected. His father had never left the city. All these years, Calvin had been less than 20 minutes away. "Son of a gun," he muttered, taking a sip of his drink. Memories poured in. Garrett was 6 when he woke up one morning to find that his dad was gone. Nora tried her best to explain, but how can you make a child understand abandonment? "Daddy had to leave," she'd said, holding his little hands. Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices. For years, Garrett sat by the window, imagining any moment he'd see his father's car pull up in front of the house. On stormy nights, when thunder scared him, his father was who he called out for, even though nobody came. At every school play to every baseball game, his eyes scanned the audience, looking for a face that was never there. Nora did all she could. She worked 2 jobs to support them, took classes at night to find better opportunities, never missed a single school event. She was both mother and father. "We make quite a team, don't we?" she used to say, pretending it was enough that they didn't need anyone else. Over time, Calvin's absence became a hole Garrett filled with determination. He studied obsessively, earned scholarships to the best schools, graduated with honors. Each achievement was a way to prove he didn't need his father, that he could be better than Calvin ever was. When he founded his company at 25, and it skyrocketed almost overnight, Garrett finally felt he had won. The abandoned boy was now a successful man, his face gracing business magazines. Sometimes he wondered if Calvin read those articles, if he knew his son had become somebody important, but he never reached out. Pride and fear of rejection held him back. And now, finding out his father had been so close all these years that he could have found him at any moment if he'd wanted to, Garrett returned to the report on the laptop. According to the data, Calvin lived in a small room at the back of the shop. The business barely sustained itself, with overdue bills and obsolete equipment. There was no record of family, relationships, or children. There were also some surveillance photos taken that same day. One showed Calvin helping the girl back into the wheelchair. Another, more recent, showed them entering the shop together at the end of the day. The girl seemed to be heading home with him. "What the heck?" Garrett leaned in to look closer. A new text appeared on the screen, his assistant updating the info in real time. The girl's name is Ellie, no registered last name, apparently no known family. Social services were called regarding her a few months ago, but there are no records of foster placement. Indications suggest she may be informally living with CF. Garrett felt his blood boil. His father, the man who had left him, who never returned to see if he was okay, who never even sent a birthday card, was now taking in a random child, giving her what he never gave his own son. He walked to the window, looking out at the illuminated city. His breath fogged the glass. The pain he thought he'd moved on from returned with full force, mixed with a bitter anger. He didn't have the guts to take care of me, but now he thinks he's a father again. The words came out like a harsh whisper, laden with resentment. Garrett felt his eyes burn but refused to cry. He'd shed too many tears for Calvin Foster as a child. He wouldn't waste any more now. His phone rang. It was Nora. "Hey, Mum," he answered, trying to keep his voice normal. "Garrett, honey, just calling to confirm tomorrow's dinner. Are you still picking me up at 7? For a moment, Garrett considered telling her about Calvin, but how could he? Nora had rebuilt her life, found happiness with a new husband after years of hardship. Why reopen old wounds? "Yes, I'll be there at 7, he replied. "Love you, Mum." "Love you too, son." After hanging up, Garrett typed another message to his assistant. "Keep investigating. I want to know everything about the girl and exactly what's happening at that shop." He shut the computer and looked out the window again. Somewhere out there, his father was probably telling bedtime stories to that girl, something he'd never done for Garrett. The wound he thought had healed was bleeding again, as fresh as the day Calvin left. The next morning, Garrett cancelled all his meetings. Sitting in the back seat of an unremarkable car, not his usual Mercedes, which would draw too much attention, he watched his father's shop across the street. He wore casual clothes and dark glasses, unrecognizable to anyone used to seeing him in designer suits on business magazine covers. "Sir, are you sure you want to stay here all day?" asked the driver, a discreet man Garrett hired for tasks requiring secrecy. "I am," he replied without taking his eyes off the shop. and I need you to be invisible." The full report on Calvin had arrived that morning, and every detail only increased Garrett's confusion and anger. His father lived practically in poverty. The shop barely turned a profit. Bills were always behind, the equipment was too old to compete with modern auto centers. Calvin lived in a makeshift room at the back of the shop. No luxuries, no comforts, just the basics to survive. He didn't own a car, either walked or took the bus. He ate in cheap diners or made simple meals in a tiny improvised kitchen. It was a life so far removed from Garrett's that it felt like another world. Around 10 in the morning, Garrett saw the girl arrive. She maneuvered the wheelchair skillfully, carrying a small backpack on her lap. Calvin stepped out to greet her, a genuine smile lighting up his time-worn face. They spoke cheerfully at the entrance before going inside together. Through the large windows of the shop, Garrett caught glimpses of their interaction. Calvin worked on cars while the girl stayed nearby, apparently doing homework. Occasionally, he would pause to explain something to her or show her how a tool worked. At one point, they laughed together, and the sight hit Garrett like a punch to the gut. When he was little, he dreamed of helping his father at the shop, learning about cars, spending time by his side. Those dreams died the day Calvin left. At lunchtime, Garrett saw them leave together and walk to a small diner on the corner. The girl, Ellie, talked non-stop, gesturing enthusiastically. Calvin listened attentively, nodding and smiling. They seemed like father and daughter for years, not two strangers who'd just met. Garrett followed them, sitting at a distant table where he could watch without being noticed. Ellie ate a sandwich with fries while Calvin only had coffee. At some point, she offered him part of her fries, which he accepted with a smile, a simple, familiar gesture. "Why her?" Garrett murmured to himself. "Why now?" For 3 days, Garrett kept up his surveillance. He saw the routine repeat. Ellie arrived in the morning, spent the day at the shop with Calvin, and at night, they headed to the small room at the back. The investigation revealed more details. Calvin had found her a few weeks ago, sleeping in a nearby playground. It appeared she'd run away from a foster home where she was neglected. Instead of calling the authorities, Calvin simply took her in. Technically, he was breaking the law, but he was also giving the girl something she clearly lacked: a home, albeit an improvised one. On the 4th day, Garrett managed to see inside the little room when Calvin opened the door to enter with Ellie. It was a tiny space, just a single bed, an old couch, and a small table. Calvin slept on the couch, giving the bed to the girl. The walls had colorful drawings, clearly Ellie's handiwork. There was also a photo on the nightstand that Garrett couldn't see clearly, but he suspected he knew what it was. That night, back in his luxurious apartment, Garrett poured a strong drink and paced restlessly. "Why does she deserve the father I never had?" The question came out loud, echoing in the empty apartment. The pain was physical, a knot in his chest that wouldn't go away. It made no sense. The man who abandoned his own son without looking back was now risking legal trouble to care for a strange girl. Garrett went to his office and pulled out a box he kept in the bottom drawer. Inside was a carefully preserved collection from his childhood: school report cards with perfect grades, academic competition medals, school newspaper clippings, photos from college graduation, achievements he'd secretly saved in case his father ever came back. "I never needed him," he said to himself, slamming the box shut. But he knew it was a lie. Every achievement had been, in some way, an attempt to prove his worth, to be good enough that Calvin would want to return. His phone rang. It was Nora, his mother. Garrett hesitated before answering. How could he talk to her now without revealing everything he'd discovered? "Hi, Mom," he finally said, trying to sound normal. "You sound strange, honey. Is everything okay?" Even after all these years, Nora could still read him through his voice. "Just tired from work," he lied. "How's Roger?" referring to his stepfather. As Nora talked about everyday life with her husband, Garrett wondered how she'd managed to move on. Did she forgive Calvin? Or just learn to live with the wound as Garrett thought he had? After hanging up, Garrett made his decision. He couldn't just watch from afar anymore. He needed to confront the past, look the man who left him in the eye, and demand answers. "There's no forgiveness for what he did," he said quietly, staring at a photo of himself as a child. Not after all these years. Tomorrow he would go to the shop, not as the abandoned boy, but as the man he'd become. Strong, successful, unshakable. Calvin needed to know the son he left behind survived, thrived, and didn't need him. Never did. And maybe, just maybe, find out why a stranger deserved what he never got. The morning was cold when Garrett parked in front of Calvin's shop. He'd chosen a time when the street would be quieter. He didn't want an audience for what he was about to do. He wore simple clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt, but still seemed out of place in that working-class neighborhood. His heart pounded in his chest. All night, he'd rehearsed what to say, the questions he'd ask, how he'd stay composed. But now, standing before the worn sign of Calvin's Auto Repair swaying in the wind, he felt like a 6-year-old again, unable to understand why his father left. That's when he saw her. Ellie was sitting in her wheelchair outside the shop, playing with a piece of wood she'd roughly carved to look like a doll. She hummed softly as she waved the doll around, crafting stories in her mind. Garrett hesitated. He hadn't planned on meeting the girl first. He wanted to go straight to his father, say what he needed to say, and leave. But now, he stood there on the sidewalk, looking at the child who seemed so at home in the workshop that should have been his place to grow up. Ellie noticed him and looked up. For a moment, she simply observed him, curious. Then, to Garrett's surprise, a smile brightened her face, and she waved. "Hi," she called out, with the simple directness of a child. "You here to fix your car?" Garrett took a few steps closer, unsure how to respond. "No, Ellie tilted her head, studying him with sharp eyes. Her smile grew wider, as though she'd discovered a secret. "You're his son, aren't you?" she asked, pointing inside the shop. "He doesn't talk much, but when he does talk about you, his eyes light up." The words caught him off guard, like a blow he didn't see coming. Calvin talked about him, and with affection. It made no sense. If Calvin cared so much, why had he never come back? "You're mistaken," Garrett said coldly. "I'm no one's son." But his tone didn't intimidate Ellie. "You have the same eyes as his," she insisted. "Blue like the sky, and you're in the photo he keeps by his bed." Garrett tried to ignore it, but the girl's voice echoed inside him. Calvin kept a picture of him. All these years by his bed? Why? Then the shop door opened, and Calvin came out, drying his hands on a grease-stained rag, probably expecting a customer. When his eyes found Garrett's, he froze. The rag slipped from his hands. "Garrett," he whispered, as though the name was too sacred to say out loud. The silence that followed was thick with decades of absence. Garrett felt the anger he had so carefully practiced overnight surge back full force. Ellie's words were momentarily forgotten. Calvin took a hesitant step toward him, eyes brimming with tears. "Son, You don't need to say anything," Garrett cut him off, voice firm and controlled. "I just came to see for myself." "The girl who got the father I never had." Calvin seemed to shrink at those words. He swallowed hard and tried again to approach. "Garrett, you lost that right," Garrett snapped bitterly. "I don't have a father. The man who left me, who made my mother cry night after night, has no right to redeem himself by being some other kid's hero." The street was far too quiet. Garrett could hear his own breathing, ragged with emotion. Ellie looked from one to the other, worried, her make-believe forgotten. The reunion was cold, painful, nothing like the emotional reconciliations in movies. Calvin didn't try to justify himself. He offered no elaborate excuses. He simply lowered his eyes, accepting each word as a deserved blow. "I know," he said finally, voice hoarse. "I know I don't even deserve to hear you about... But if you could..." "There's nothing to say," Garrett interrupted again. "I grew up. I survived. I didn't miss you." It was a lie, and part of him knew it. Calvin had been missed on every birthday, at every graduation, every time a son needs a father. But admitting that would show weakness, and Garrett refused to appear vulnerable. "She may call you Dad," he said, pointing at Ellie, "but to me, you're just someone who gave up." With those words, he turned on his heel, ready to return to his car and leave behind that moment. that place, that man. But he felt a tug on his arm. Ellie had wheeled quickly to him, gripping him with surprising strength for someone so small. "Wait," she said, her green eyes fixed on his. "He doesn't ask me to call him Dad. You know, I don't call him that." Garrett looked at the girl, ready to shake her off, but something in her honest gaze made him pause. "He helps me because he knows what it's like to be alone," Ellie continued, her voice firm despite her age. "He speaks kindly. He never says bad things about you. He just says he's sorry, that he wishes he'd been different." Ellie's words fell on him like raindrops after a long drought, painful but necessary. Garrett looked over his shoulder. Calvin was still standing in the same spot, shoulders slumped, eyes on the ground, like a man carrying an invisible weight for so long he'd forgotten how to stand straight. "If he was bad to you," Ellie went on, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "maybe he's trying to be good to me. Isn't that what good people do? They try to fix what they still can." The innocent question hit Garrett like a punch in the stomach. Was she right? Could things be fixed? Some wounds were irreparable, weren't they? For a moment, he thought about all the customers Calvin must have helped over the years, fixing broken cars, returning them better than before. Maybe the shop wasn't just a workplace, but a metaphor for his own life, a place where he tried to fix whatever he could, even knowing some things were too damaged. Garrett didn't answer Ellie. He didn't know what to say. Gently, he freed his arm from the girl's grasp. He took a deep breath, looked at Calvin for a second, one charged glance brimming with all that was left unsaid, and left in silence. In the car, hands trembling on the wheel, he wondered if he'd gotten what he wanted. He'd come to confront his father, to show his anger and pain, but he left with more questions than answers, with a crack in the wall of resentment he'd built over the years. He glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Calvin was now crouched beside Ellie, who seemed to be comforting him. An elderly man and a small girl in a wheelchair, a most unlikely family, each broken in their own way, somehow helping to mend each other. Garrett drove away, that image seared into his mind, Ellie's question echoing, "Isn't that what good people do? They try to fix what they still can." 3 days had passed since the confrontation at the shop. Garrett had thrown himself into work, trying to forget his father's devastated face and Ellie's unsettling words. During important meetings, he caught himself thinking of the photo that Ellie said Calvin kept by his bed. Could it be true? Why would a man who abandoned his son keep a picture of him all those years? Morning was rainy when his assistant rushed into his office. "Mr. Foster, there's a situation in the lobby. A child is causing a commotion, saying she needs to speak with you urgently. Security is trying to remove her, but she refuses to leave." Garrett frowned. "A child?" "Yes, in a wheelchair. She's quite agitated." "Ellie." It could be no one else. When the elevator opened to the lobby, Garrett saw the small chaos. Ellie struggled against 2 security guards who were gently trying to escort her out. Her face was red and soaked with tears, her hair disheveled, her clothes wet from the rain. "I need to talk to him. It's an emergency," she shouted, her high-pitched voice echoing through the elegant marble lobby. "Miss, we can't let you up without authorization," one of the guards said, clearly uncomfortable dealing with a distressed wheelchair-bound child. Garrett crossed the lobby quickly. "It's all right, I know her." At the sight of him, Ellie stopped fighting. Her eyes, swollen from crying, widened with relief. "Garrett, you have to come. Right now," she exclaimed, her voice breaking with desperation. He knelt to be at her eye level. Despite all his anger toward Calvin, seeing Ellie in that state alarmed him. "What happened?" "It's Calvin," she sobbed between hiccups. "He collapsed on the shop floor. He was holding his chest. He couldn't get up. He said your name before I left." Her voice failed. Then, summoning all her courage, she grabbed his suit sleeve. "He's your dad and he's in bad shape. Don't let him die." Something shattered inside Garrett at those words. All the defenses he'd built against Calvin suddenly seemed meaningless compared to Ellie's genuine panic. "Let's go." "My car's in the garage." At the shop, they found Calvin on the floor between the tool bench and a car on a lift. He was conscious, but his breathing was shallow and difficult. One hand clutched his chest, and his face was contorted in pain. Seeing Garrett, His eyes went wide with surprise and hope. "Garrett," he whispered with difficulty. "Don't talk," Garrett ordered, kneeling beside him. Years of resentment were briefly set aside by the basic instinct to help someone in danger. "We're taking you to the hospital." Garrett realized how light his father was as he lifted him into the car. Calvin, the man who'd once seemed so strong, now felt as fragile as paper in his arms. Ellie was beside them, pushing her wheelchair as fast as she could, whispering encouraging words. "You'll be fine, Calvin. Garrett's here. He came to get you." During the ride, Calvin lost consciousness. Garrett ran red lights, while Ellie, in the back seat, held Calvin's hand. "Faster," she begged, her voice trembling. "Eyes too quiet." At St. Mary's Hospital emergency, Calvin was taken in immediately. "Heart attack," Garrett heard a doctor say as they rushed the stretcher down the corridor. The ICU doors closed, leaving Garrett and Ellie in the waiting room, both silent, united by their concern for this man, who meant so much to each in different ways. Hours passed. Ellie fell asleep in her chair, exhausted from stress and physical effort. Garrett stayed awake, pacing, checking his watch every few minutes. Why was he so worried? Why this knot in his stomach? Wasn't this what he'd always wanted? To see Calvin suffer as he had suffered? But no. He realized he'd never truly wanted harm for his father. His anger was about the absence, not the man himself. Finally, a doctor appeared. "Family of Calvin Foster." Garrett stepped forward. "I'm his son. Your father had a major heart attack. We managed to stabilize him, but his heart is compromised. He'll need surgery within the next 48 hours, once he's strong enough." The doctor paused. "He's older, in fragile health. Recovery will be long and will require constant care. He can't live alone anymore." Garrett nodded, absorbing the seriousness of the situation. "Can I see him?" "Briefly. He's still sedated." In the ICU, Calvin looked smaller and more fragile than ever, hooked up to tubes and monitors. His skin was pale, and his white hair contrasted sharply with the hospital pillow. Garrett stood there, watching his father's chest rise and fall, the steady beep of the heart monitor the only sign of life. "He'll need someone to care for him," a nurse said, checking vitals. "After surgery, recovery will be delicate." Garrett didn't respond. His mind was spinning with conflicting thoughts. Should he take Calvin home? Put him in a nursing facility? The idea unsettled him more than he'd like to admit. When he returned to the waiting room, Ellie was awake, eyes anxious. "Is he okay?" she asked immediately. "He's stable. Needs surgery." Ellie nodded, as though she were processing something too big for her age. "Can I see him?" Garrett hesitated. "Hospital rules." "Please," she begged. "He's my family now." Her words struck him unexpectedly. Family. That's what he and Calvin should have been, what they briefly were so long ago. "I'll see what I can do," he answered, surprising himself. Using his influence, Garrett arranged a short visit for Ellie. She wheeled quietly into the ICU, only holding Calvin's hand for a few minutes, whispering words Garrett couldn't hear. Later, while Ellie finally agreed to rest in a private room Garrett had arranged, he decided to go to the shop to get some clothes and personal items for his father. The place was exactly as Calvin had left it, tools everywhere. The car he was working on still with the hood open, a half-finished cup of coffee on the bench. In the tiny room out back, Garrett hesitated before entering, feeling like an intruder in his father's private life. The space was even smaller than he'd imagined. The narrow bed was made, just one pillow and a thin blanket. The old couch where Calvin had slept since Ellie arrived looked far too uncomfortable for someone with back problems. Then he noticed the simple wardrobe in the corner. He opened it, looking for clothes to bring to the hospital, but what he found made him freeze. On a carefully organized shelf were photos. Many photos, Garrett at his college graduation, from a distance, as if taken by someone watching from afar. Garrett on the cover of Forbes magazine, carefully clipped and saved. A photo of his company building on opening day. With trembling hands, Garrett examined the collection. There were newspaper and magazine clippings, all about him. His awards, business successes, interviews. Some clippings were over 15 years old, yellowed with time but still preserved. Calvin had followed his entire life, at a distance, in silence, but followed it nonetheless. At the back of the wardrobe, Garrett found more clippings arranged by date, articles from his local school paper mentioning him in math championships, a small mention in the college paper about his scholarship, the first time his name appeared in a financial magazine when he was just a promising employee. Garrett sat on the narrow bed, clippings scattered around him. He felt dizzy, as though the ground had dropped beneath his feet. All his certainties about who Calvin was and what had happened began to blur. The reality of the contrast between their lives hit him with tremendous force, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, Garrett allowed himself to feel something other than anger toward Calvin. He allowed himself to feel compassion. Garrett spent the night at the hospital. The waiting room chairs were uncomfortable, but he refused to leave. Ellie finally fell asleep, curled up in a blanket a kind nurse had given her. The girl slept in an awkward position in her wheelchair, but she was so exhausted she didn't wake up. The sun was starting to rise when the doctor came to speak with Garrett. "We managed to stabilize him. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning," the doctor explained. "He's awake now and asked to see you." Garrett swallowed hard. What would he say to his father? The anger he'd carried for so many years had receded after seeing those pictures, those clippings. It hadn't disappeared, but it felt different, like an old wound that no longer bled but still hurt when touched. "Is he strong enough to talk?" Garrett asked. "For a few minutes only." "Don't tire him." Garrett nodded and followed the doctor through the hospital corridors. The ICU was quiet except for the constant beeping of monitors. Calvin was in a bed at the far end, separated from other patients by curtains. When Garrett approached, his father was awake, staring at the ceiling. "There's someone here to see you, Mr. Foster," said the nurse. Calvin slowly turned his head. His eyes, still that intense blue Garrett had inherited, lit up at the sight of his son. For a moment, neither spoke. The heart monitor showed some elevated beats, then returned to normal. "You came," Calvin finally said, his voice rough and weak. Garrett pulled up a chair and sat by the bed. "Yes," he replied simply. "Ellie? She's sleeping in the waiting room. She refused to leave." A small smile crossed Calvin's tired face. "She's stubborn." I noticed. Silence returned, laden with unspoken truths. Calvin closed his eyes for a moment, gathering strength. When he opened them again, there was a determination that surprised Garrett. "I don't know how much time I've got," Calvin began. "Don't talk like that. You'll get through the surgery and—" "Please," Calvin interrupted, "let me speak while I have the courage." Garrett fell silent, heart pounding. For 28 years, he'd imagined this moment, what he'd say, how he'd react. Now that it was happening, he didn't know what to do with his hands or where to look. "I never stopped thinking about you," Calvin said, voice weak but clear. "Not a single day." Garrett wanted to say something, maybe deny it, maybe accuse, but the words wouldn't come. The images of those photos and clippings in the wardrobe were still too fresh in his mind. "I left because I thought you both would be better off without me," Calvin went on. "I was sinking, drinking, in debt, depressed. I thought I was a burden, that your mother would find someone better, that you'd have a real father." He paused, breathing heavily. The nurse stepped closer to check the monitors, but Calvin waved her away. "I'm fine," he murmured, then turned back to Garrett. "When I realized the mistake I'd made, I tried to come back. But your mother, she was right to keep me away. I was a mess. And you—" his voice broke. "You seem to be doing so well, growing strong, brilliant in school." "How did you know?" Garrett asked, his voice lower than he intended. "I went to see you," Calvin confessed, eyes filling with tears, "from a distance, at your school games, your performances. Always in the back, where nobody would notice, just to make sure you were okay." Garrett felt a lump in his throat. He remembered scanning the crowd, sometimes thinking he caught a glimpse of someone resembling his father. "Several times. I even went to the building where you work," Calvin continued. "I stood across the street, watching people come and go, wondering what it would be like to walk in and talk to you." He gave a sad smile. "But I always froze. From shame, From fear. What would I say? How would I explain? Calvin raised a trembling hand toward Garrett, but stopped midway and uncertain. I saw every article about you, every award. I always knew you'd be great. The emotion in those words, their raw sincerity, washed over Garrett like a wave. He pictured Calvin, an uneducated mechanic, trying to read complex articles about finance and tech just to understand his son's work. Why didn't you come to me directly? Garrett asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Calvin looked at his own hands, stained with grease that would never fully wash away. At first, because I didn't deserve it, I thought I needed to prove something, to become someone better first. Then, the more time passed, the harder it got. Every birthday, every Christmas I missed was like the distance kept growing. He paused. And then you became this incredible man. Successful, respected. What could I offer? An old mechanic who can barely pay his bills. You could have offered the truth, Garrett replied, surprised at his own calm. That's all I ever wanted. I know. Calvin nodded, guilt etched into every line of his aged face. I did everything wrong. And I understand if you can never forgive me. The heart monitor began to speed up, and Calvin closed his eyes, breathing heavily. Mr. Foster, you need to rest now, said the nurse, stepping in again. Calvin grabbed her arm. Just one more minute, please. The nurse looked to Garrett, who nodded. Garrett, Calvin continued, locking eyes with his son as though trying to convey decades of feelings in a few seconds. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know I'm proud of you, of the man you've become. And that, his voice faltered, that has nothing to do with me. It's all you and your mother. Garrett felt something warm and wet slide down his face. He was crying, he realized with surprise. He hadn't cried since he was a child. Mr. Foster, he really needs to rest now, the nurse insisted more firmly. Garrett stood up, suddenly unsure what to say. He wanted to shout at Calvin for all the lost years, for all the lies he'd told himself. But he also wanted, what exactly? Forgiveness, understanding, maybe a bit of both. I'll come back tomorrow, he finally said, before the surgery. Calvin nodded weakly, exhausted by the conversation, but his eyes stayed on his son's face until Garrett left. In the corridor, away from his father's eyes, Garrett leaned against the wall, breathing deeply, trying to process everything he'd just heard. The truths Calvin had swallowed for years were now laid bare, raw and painful. The anger was still there, but there was something new, too. Something fragile and undefined, like a tiny sprout breaking through concrete. Garrett spent the night at the hospital. The waiting room chairs were uncomfortable, but he refused to leave. Ellie finally fell asleep, curled up in a blanket a nurse had brought her. She slept in an awkward position in her wheelchair, too exhausted to stir. The sun was beginning to rise when the doctor came looking for Garrett. We managed to stabilize him. The surgery is set for tomorrow morning, said the doctor. He's conscious now and asked to see you. Garrett swallowed. What would he say to his father? The rage he'd carried for so long seemed to have receded after seeing those photos and clippings. It hadn't vanished, but it was different. Like an old wound that doesn't bleed anymore but still aches when touched. Is he strong enough to talk? Garrett asked. Just for a few minutes. Please don't tire him. Garrett nodded and followed the doctor down the hospital corridors. The ICU was silent except for the steady beep of monitors. Calvin lay in a bed at the far end, partitions separating him from other patients. Approaching, Garrett saw his father awake, staring at the ceiling. There's someone here to see you, Mr. Foster, said the nurse. Calvin turned his head slowly. His eyes, still that intense blue shared with Garrett, lit up when he saw his son. For a moment, neither spoke. The heart monitor registered a slight uptick, then returned to normal. You came, Calvin finally said, his voice raspy and weak. Garrett pulled up a chair next to the bed. Yes, he replied simply. Ellie? She's asleep in the waiting area. She wouldn't leave. A faint smile crossed Calvin's tired features. She's stubborn. I noticed. Silence again, heavy with everything unsaid. Calvin closed his eyes for a moment, mustering strength. When he opened them, There was a resolve in them that surprised Garrett. "I don't know how much time I have," Calvin began. "Don't talk like that. You're going to have surgery and—" "Please," Calvin interrupted. "Let me speak while I have the courage." Garrett fell silent, heart racing. For 28 years he'd envisioned this moment, what he'd say, how he'd respond. Now that it was happening, he felt at a loss for where to put his hands, how to meet his father's eyes. "I never stopped thinking of you," Calvin said, voice weak but steady. "Not for a single day." Garrett wanted to say something, perhaps deny it or accuse, but the words wouldn't come. He still had that vivid image of the photos and clippings in the wardrobe. "I left because I thought you two would be better off without me," Calvin continued. "I was drowning in drinking, debt, depression. I thought I was a burden, that your mother would find someone better, and you'd have a real father." He paused, breathing with difficulty. A nurse came over to check the monitors, but Calvin gestured for her to stay back. "I'm okay," he murmured, then turned to Garrett again. "When I realized what a mistake I'd made, I tried to come back, but your mom, she was right to keep me away. I was a wreck. And you," his voice choked, "you seemed to be doing so well, growing strong, so bright at school." "How did you know?" Garrett asked, voice quieter than he intended. "I went to watch you," Calvin admitted, tears glistening in his eyes. "From a distance, your school games, your performances, always in the back, hoping nobody would notice me, just to be sure you were fine." Garrett felt a knot in his throat. He recalled countless times scanning the audience, briefly thinking he saw someone who looked like his father. "I even went by your office building several times," Calvin went on. "I'd stand across the street, watching people go in and out, imagining what it would be like to see you, talk to you." He gave a sad smile. "But I always froze, out of shame, fear. What would I say? How would I explain?" Calvin reached a trembling hand toward Garrett, but stopped, unsure. "I saw every article about you, every award. I always knew you'd be someone great." The raw sincerity in his voice hit Garrett like a wave. He imagined Calvin, an unschooled mechanic, trying to read complex tech and financial pieces just to keep up with his son's life. "Then why never reach out directly?" Garrett asked, voice more controlled than he felt. Calvin studied his own hands, permanently marked with grease. "At first, because I didn't deserve it. I thought I needed to prove something, to become someone better. Then, as time went by, it only got harder. Every birthday, every Christmas I missed, added another layer of distance." He paused. "And then you became this amazing man, successful, respected. What could I offer? An old mechanic who can barely pay his bills." "You could have offered the truth," Garrett answered, surprised at how calm he sounded. "That's all I ever wanted." "I know," Calvin nodded, guilt lining his aged face. I messed everything up, and I understand if you never forgive me." The heart monitor quickened, and Calvin shut his eyes, struggling to breathe. "Mr. Foster, you need to rest," the nurse said, coming closer again. Calvin clung to her arm. "Just one more minute, please." The nurse looked at Garrett, who agreed with a slight nod. "Garrett," Calvin said again, meeting his son's gaze with an intensity that seemed to compress decades into seconds. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know. I'm proud of you, of the man you've become, and that," his voice faltered, "that had nothing to do with me. It was all you and your mom." Garrett felt something warm trailing down his face. He realized he was crying, to his own surprise. He hadn't cried since he was little. "Mr. Foster, he really needs to rest now," the nurse insisted more firmly. Garrett stood, suddenly unsure how to respond. He wanted to yell at Calvin for all the lost years, for all the self-deceptions. But he also wanted, what exactly? Forgiveness, understanding, maybe a bit of both. "I'll be back tomorrow," he finally said. "Before the surgery?" Calvin nodded faintly, exhausted from talking, but his eyes never left his son's face until Garrett was gone. In the hallway, away from his father's gaze, Garrett leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths, trying to process everything he'd just heard. The truths Calvin had bottled up for years were now raw and painful, laid bare. The anger remained, But there was something else too, something fragile, something like a small shoot emerging through concrete. Calvin's surgery lasted 6 hours. Garrett stayed in the hospital the entire time, working remotely on his laptop, getting periodic updates from the doctors. Ellie stayed by his side, drawing in a sketchpad a nurse had given her, occasionally showing her creations to Garrett, who would nod with a reserved smile. When the doctor finally came out with the news that the surgery was successful, Ellie clapped her hands, and Garrett let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "He'll need special care for a while," the doctor explained. "Recovery will be slow given his age." "How long in the hospital?" Garrett asked. "At least 2 weeks, then at home rest for at least a month. No physical strain, controlled diet, regular medication." Garrett nodded, taking it all in. The reality of Calvin's situation was setting in. His father was old, alone, and now ill. Despite the lingering bitterness, something had changed after that conversation in the hospital. In the days that followed, Garrett established a routine. Each morning before work, he stopped by the hospital. The visits were brief and subdued. They didn't talk much, mostly remarks about the weather, questions about medication, or updates on old customers who called asking about the mechanic, but it was a start. Sometimes they sat in silence, watching the news on the small TV in the room. It was a different silence than during the confrontation, less tense, more contemplative. In the evenings, after work, Garrett returned to the hospital. Often he found Ellie already there, sitting by the bed, telling Calvin about her day or reading aloud from a worn library book. One day, Garrett noticed Ellie struggling with her wheelchair, the wheel locking up repeatedly as she tried to move around the room. "Acting up again?" he asked, crouching to inspect it. "It always locks when the weather changes," she explained, frustrated. "Calvin's fixed it a bunch of times, but it keeps happening." That very night, Garrett went online and ordered the best wheelchair he could find, specifically designed for active kids. When it arrived 2 days later, Ellie's eyes went wide as he brought it into the hospital room. "Is that for me?" she asked in disbelief, touching the lightweight carbon fiber arms. "Your old one's slowing you down," Garrett replied, trying to sound practical, though he felt an odd sense of satisfaction at the girl's excitement. "Can't have you stuck with a locked wheel." Ellie tested the chair, gliding easily down the hospital corridor, returning with a grin that lit up her face. Suddenly, she stopped in front of Garrett and looked at him seriously. "Thank you. Calvin will be happy to see you care about me." Her words caught him off guard. "I didn't do it for him," he said quickly. Ellie just smiled, as though she knew something he didn't. Over the days, Garrett's presence at the hospital became more frequent and lasted longer. Calvin slowly improved, regaining color and strength. Sometimes Garrett caught him looking his way with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, some mix of gratitude and admiration. Ellie had become a bridge between them. Whenever the silence stretched on, she would appear with a question, a comment, or a story to ease the tension. She showed Garrett her drawings and little inventions made from hospital odds and ends, a helicopter made from popsicle sticks, a toy car with bottle cap wheels. "Do you make stuff like this at your company?" she asked one day, showing him a detailed sketch of a robot. "Not exactly," Garrett replied, impressed by the girl's creativity. "We make software, not robots." "What software?" The question led to an explanation that, to Garrett's surprise, turned into nearly an hour of him discussing technology. Calvin listened quietly, wearing a faint smile as he watched his son enthusiastically gesturing, simplifying complex concepts so Ellie could understand. Slowly, Garrett found himself engaging more with Ellie's questions, listening to her stories, laughing at her naive yet often surprisingly astute observations about life. "You could come by more often," she said one afternoon, playing with a small puzzle Garrett had brought. "Calvin smiles differently when you're around. You do too, even if you don't know it." Garrett laughed unintentionally, caught off guard by her remark. It was true, he had begun smiling more without realizing it. When Calvin was finally discharged, Garrett took him directly to his own apartment. The decision wasn't formal, it just happened. Ellie would come during the day to keep Calvin company while Garrett worked, and a professional nurse would handle the medical side of recovery. The penthouse, once so impersonal and minimalist, began to show signs of its new inhabitants. Ellie's drawings on the fridge, mechanics books on the coffee table, a colorful blanket on the couch, small touches that, surprisingly, made the place feel more like home. Calvin's convalescence progressed slowly. The doctors had been clear about the limitations. He'd have to significantly reduce his workload at the shop if he ever wanted to return. This news saddened him, but it didn't break him. "I can still teach, even if I can't do everything I used to," he said one afternoon, sitting on Garrett's balcony, gazing at the city below. "Teach what?" Garrett asked, working on his laptop nearby. "Mechanics? To young people. I've always thought about doing that someday." Garrett looked up, intrigued. He'd never imagined his father as a teacher, but it made sense. Calvin was patient, knowledgeable, and had a gift for explaining complex things simply. One afternoon, Garrett came home early and found Calvin and Ellie at the kitchen table, surrounded by metal scraps and wire. Calvin was showing Ellie how to bend the wire to make a little sculpture. "What are you two making?" Garrett asked, setting his briefcase on the counter. "Scrap art," Ellie said enthusiastically. "Calvin's teaching me how to make a little horse. At the shop, I always saved leftover parts," Calvin explained. "You can do a lot with what other people throw away." Garrett watched them work together, Calvin's wrinkled, experienced hands guiding Ellie's small ones, teaching her how to twist the wire the right way. "Look, it turned out more like a dog than a horse," Ellie laughed, showing her creation. "It's a very good little dog," Calvin responded, with that gentle smile Garrett was growing used to seeing. Without realizing it, Garrett joined them at the table. Calvin offered him a piece of wire. "Want to try? It's harder than it looks." Garrett accepted. In his inexperienced hands, the wire refused to take on any recognizable shape. Calvin watched for a moment, then silently moved his chair closer and placed his hands over Garrett's, guiding him in the correct motions. It was the first time in nearly 30 years his father had touched him. Calvin's hands were rough, calloused from decades of manual work, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. For a moment, Garrett felt like a child again, learning something new from his dad. "Like this," Calvin said softly. "Don't force it. Let the metal find its way." They worked side by side, in silence, but it was a comfortable, almost conspiratorial silence. What was being shaped at that table went far beyond wires and metal. When they finished, they had a small wire family, the horse dog by Ellie, something vaguely bird-like by Garrett, and a perfectly detailed car by Calvin. "We can put them at the shop when you're back to work," Ellie suggested, arranging the three pieces together. "I'd like that," Calvin replied, looking not at the sculptures but at Garrett. From her spot at the table, Ellie watched them with a wise smile. She saw what maybe they hadn't fully realized yet, that with small steps, something was being rebuilt between father and son, something far beyond wire sculptures or auto repairs. Bellini's restaurant had been Nora's favorite for years. Elegant but not pretentious, with soft lighting and background music at the perfect volume for intimate conversations. Garrett always reserved the same table for their monthly dinners, by the window overlooking the small indoor garden, away from the main entrance bustle. He arrived 15 minutes early, as always. Punctuality was one of the many values Nora had instilled in him, along with honesty, perseverance, and the importance of keeping his back straight. He ordered a Pinot Noir he knew she liked and waited, mentally rehearsing, yet again, what to say. How to tell his mother that the man who abandoned them was back in his life. He saw Nora arrive in the window's reflection. Even at 60, she carried herself in a way that turned heads, not for classic beauty, though she was still attractive, but for that impeccable posture and the aura of dignity she radiated. Her grey hair, cut in an elegant bob, framed a face marked by both time and determination. "Sorry I'm late, dear," she said, approaching him and leaning in to kiss his cheek. "Traffic was impossible." "You're only 3 minutes late, Mom," Garrett replied with a smile, standing to pull out her chair. "Basically early, by your standards." Nora smiled, the same smile that had soothed Garrett since childhood. "Still cheeky, I see. Roger sends his regards." He wanted to come, but he had a commitment with the foundation. Roger Campbell was Nora's husband of 15 years, a retired college professor who now ran an arts foundation, a gentleman who never tried to replace Garrett's absent father, but offered Nora stability and companionship when she finally allowed herself to love again. The waiter came, took their orders, grilled salmon for Nora, medium steak for Garrett, and poured the wine. A familiar, predictable routine, but tonight would be different. Garrett had known that from the moment he woke up, feeling a weight in his stomach that wasn't just anxiety. It was the sense he was about to break a silent pact of almost 3 decades. "You're quiet today," Nora observed, cutting a piece of salmon delicately. "Work trouble?" Garrett took a deep breath, twirling the wine glass between his fingers. "No, actually." He hesitated, searching for the right words. There were none. "I found Calvin." Nora's fork froze in midair. Her face, always so warm, hardened subtly, like porcelain threatening to crack. For a moment, time seemed to stop in the elegant restaurant. "Calvin," she repeated, placing the fork beside her plate with deliberate care. "I see." "It was by accident," Garrett explained quickly. "I saw him on the street with a kid, a girl. Then I found out he's taking care of her. She has no family." Nora nodded mechanically, as if processing each word individually before forming a complete meaning. "He had a heart attack," Garrett continued. "He's recovering at my apartment right now." A tense silence followed. Garrett realized he'd said too much, too fast. But how do you ease into the fact that the man who abandoned both of you had reappeared in his life? "At your apartment?" Nora finally repeated, her voice controlled. "You took him into your home." It wasn't a question, but Garrett felt compelled to answer. Yes, he had nowhere else to go. "The shop, it's no place for someone to recover." "He still has that shop?" A flicker of surprise passed across Nora's face. "Yes, all these years, he's been in the same city." Nora took a sip of wine, eyes fixed on some point beyond Garrett's shoulder. For a moment, she seemed to be seeing another time, another place. Maybe the little house they'd lived in, all 3 of them so long ago. Maybe the day Calvin left, never to return. When she finally looked at Garrett, there was a carefully composed coldness in her gaze, like hastily raised armor. "And how do you feel about all this?" The question caught him off guard. He expected anger, blame, maybe even a request to break contact. Not this concern, so typical of her, always putting his needs above her own, even when the pain was shared. "Confused," he admitted. "At first I was furious. I confronted him, said awful things. Understandable. But then..." Garrett hesitated. How to explain the gradual shift happening inside him? How to describe seeing all those clippings and photos about himself, carefully saved by Calvin all these years? "He's not who I imagined. Or maybe he is, but there's more to him. I can't really explain." Nora set down her utensils, clearly having lost her appetite. "Garrett, you don't have to explain yourself. He's your father. It's natural you'd want to understand." "I'm not excusing what he did," he said quickly. "I just want to figure out who he is now." A sad smile tugged at Nora's lips. "You've always been like that. Even as a child, you needed to understand how things work, take them apart to see the mechanics." She paused. "I guess you're doing that with Calvin now. Taking him apart to figure him out." "Maybe," Garrett admitted. Then carefully, "He asked about you." Nora's face hardened instantly. "I have nothing I want to hear from him." "He's not asking to see you," Garrett clarified. "He just asked if you're well, if you're happy." "And what did you say?" "The truth. That you built a good life. That Roger is a decent man who treats you as you deserve." Nora nodded slowly. "Thank you." Silence again, laden with decades of unasked questions and unanswered truths. "He's changed, Mom," Garrett said finally. "I'm not justifying his past, but he's not the same man who left us." "People rarely are who they were 30 years ago," Nora replied, her tone gentle but firm. "We've all changed. We had to, but the pain doesn't change so easily." Her hands, always so steady, trembled slightly as she picked up her wineglass. "He may have changed, but I don't know if I can change what he left behind in here." Her hand briefly touched her chest, a motion so quick it could go unnoticed by anyone who didn't know her well. I understand, Garrett said. I'm not asking you to forgive him. No? Nora looked at him intently. Then what are you asking, son? The question hovered between them, raw and direct. What was he asking for? Permission? Understanding? I don't know, he finally admitted. Maybe I just needed you to know. Nora reached across the table for Garrett's hand. I've had questions for so long, she said, her voice softer now. Why didn't he fight harder? Why did he give up so easily? If he loved you the way he claimed, how could he just leave? For the first time, Garrett saw beyond the mask of strength his mother always wore. He saw the young woman who'd been abandoned with a small child, struggling not just with practical hardships, but with the ghost of unanswered questions. Sometimes, Nora went on, almost talking to herself, I find myself wondering what might have been, how life would be if he'd stayed, or if he'd come back when you were still little. She gave a sad smile. It's a weakness, I know. Roger is a good man. I have a good life now. It's not weakness, Mum, Garrett said gently. It's human. A week after that conversation, Nora was in her garden pruning roses. It had become her therapeutic activity over the years. Roger had traveled on business, and the large house was quiet except for occasional birdsong. The late afternoon sun cast golden patches on the neatly trimmed lawn, and a soft breeze carried the scent of flowers. She heard a car stopping in front of the house, probably a lost delivery driver or salesman. She continued working, enjoying the sunlight on her face. Nora. The voice behind her froze her in place. It was a voice she hadn't heard in decades but would recognize anywhere. Harsher now, more weary, but unmistakable. Slowly, she straightened up and turned around. Calvin stood a few yards away, respecting her space. He looked smaller than she remembered, frailer. His hair was fully white now, his face etched by time and the sun. He wore a clean shirt and simple pants, clearly making an effort to look presentable. What struck her most, though, were his eyes. Those blue eyes that once were so lively, so full of promise, now seemed burdened by a weariness beyond the physical. What are you doing here? She asked, surprised her own voice was so calm when her heart was pounding. I needed to see you, Calvin replied, eyes down. Garrett gave me your address and he doesn't know I came. Don't blame him. Shouldn't you be resting? Garrett mentioned your surgery. Some things can't wait, he said simply. Nora set the pruning shears on the stone table. She pulled off her gloves methodically, buying time, trying to align her thoughts. Why are you here, Calvin? She asked bluntly. He took a deep breath as though gathering courage. To ask forgiveness, he said, looking her in the eyes for the first time. I know I don't deserve it. I know it's too late, but I needed to say it. Anyway. Nora crossed her arms, as if protecting herself. Forgiveness, she repeated, testing the word. Do you have any idea what you left behind? What we went through to survive after you left? No, Calvin admitted, and it haunts me every day. Garrett cried for you every night for months, Nora continued, her words now flowing freely. He'd sit by the window, waiting for you to come back. At every school event, he searched for your face among the other parents. With every disappointment, I watched a piece of him break. Calvin didn't look away, absorbing each word as a deserved blow. I know there aren't enough excuses. Nora studied the man before her. In his eyes, she saw not just regret, but a profound, old pain. Do you remember the letters you wrote to Garrett? She asked suddenly. Calvin looked surprised by the shift in topic. The letters? Yes, of course. His eyes took on a distant shine. I wrote so many, begging for a chance. I thought he never got them. Nora glanced away, suddenly unable to meet his eyes. I got them. All of them. But I never opened any. I hid them. Her voice cracked slightly. I thought I was protecting him, but maybe I was just protecting myself. The revelation hung between them, heavy like an oncoming storm. You hid them. Calvin seemed to struggle with understanding. All of them. They're in a box in the attic, Nora admitted, guilt clear in her voice. I could never throw them away, but I could never give them to him either. Calvin ran a hand over his face, eyes wet. All these years, I thought he just didn't want to hear from me. He was a child, Calvin, a devastated one, and Nora paused. I was so afraid you'd disappoint him again, promise to return and then vanish. Have him wait for something that never came." Silent tears slid down Calvin's cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. "And I thought you two were better off without me, that he'd moved on." "We did move on," Nora said, her own voice breaking now. "We had to. But that doesn't mean there weren't scars." They stood there for a long moment, separated by a few yards and by decades of choices, both silently mourning all that might have been. "I'm sorry, Nora," Calvin finally said. "More than words can express." "I know," she replied, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. Slowly, as if testing unknown waters, Nora stepped closer. She stopped a few paces from him, studying the face of the man she once loved. She saw in him the young mechanic she'd fallen for, the man who'd proudly hold their small son, and also the stranger he'd become. "We can't go back to the beginning, Calvin," she said softly. "But maybe we can still write a better ending." Her words hung between them like a fragile offering, not exactly forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of something neither had believed possible, a path forward that didn't deny the past, but also wasn't forever trapped by it. Calvin nodded slowly, unable to speak. For a moment, they stood there, two survivors of a shipwreck long past, finally reaching the same shore, changed, battered, but still breathing. 3 months had passed since Calvin's surgery. His slow but steady recovery allowed him to leave Garrett's apartment and begin spending time at the shop again, though not working, just being in his space. The doctor was clear. No physical strain for at least another 2 months. "Is this really necessary?" Calvin asked, standing in front of the shop, watching the construction crew Garrett had hired. He gripped his cane tightly, as though it were his last anchor of independence. "The roof is literally falling in," Garrett said, pointing to broken shingles and signs of water damage. "And I bet the wiring hasn't been updated since the 70s. Calvin sighed. The shop meant more than just a workplace. It was his refuge, his identity, the only constant for decades. But he knew Garrett was right. The place was falling apart. "All right," he finally agreed. "But keep the basic layout. I know exactly where every tool should go." Garrett nodded, hiding a small smile. It was the first time he'd seen his father voluntarily give in. Small progress. In the weeks that followed, the shop underwent a complete transformation. The roof was replaced entirely, the walls were reinforced, and the electrical wiring was redone. The cracked concrete floor got new life, and obsolete equipment made way for modern, safe versions. Calvin watched it all with mixed admiration and nostalgia. Each replaced beam and reinforced wall signaled the end of an era and the start of something new. The shop he knew, with its imperfections, its characteristic smell of oil and metal, the stains on the floor that told stories of past projects, was turning into something else. Something new. "It'll still be your shop," Garrett reassured him one day, seeing his distant expression as they watched the construction. "It just won't collapse on your head," Calvin laughed, a sound that still surprised Garrett each time he heard it. Not long ago, he would have considered it impossible to share laughter with the man who abandoned him. The hardest part of Calvin's recovery wasn't the physical healing from surgery, but relearning to walk without fully depending on the cane. The daily physical therapy was a test of endurance. At first, he managed just a few steps before the pain and weakness forced him to stop. But each day, each week, he grew stronger, more balanced. "One more time," the physical therapist Garrett hired would say, offering support. "Just a few more steps than yesterday." Calvin gritted his teeth and obeyed, determined to regain his independence. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he practiced alone, leaning on walls and furniture, taking one careful step after another. One afternoon, while trying to walk without the cane in Garrett's apartment, Calvin stumbled and would have fallen if Garrett hadn't reacted quickly, catching him by the arm. "Are you okay?" Garrett asked, genuine concern in his voice. Calvin nodded, regaining his balance. "I thought I was alone. I just got in," Garrett explained. "You shouldn't be practicing without someone around." "I'm old enough to decide what I can or can't do," Calvin replied, a hint of stubbornness in his tone. Garrett recognized that stubbornness. It was the same trait he displayed when challenged. For the first time, he clearly saw part of himself reflected in his father. "How's the shop?" Calvin asked, changing the subject. "Almost ready for painting," Garrett answered. "I thought maybe you'd pick the color." Calvin considered it. "Same blue as before," he said at last. "I like consistency." On a sunny Saturday, Ellie arrived at Garrett's place, pushing her wheelchair with renewed energy. She wore a brightly colored backpack. "I came to help paint," she announced the moment Calvin opened the door. "Garrett said you're doing that today." Calvin smiled at the girl who had somehow become a constant presence in his new life. "How are you going to paint without getting covered in it?" he teased gently. Ellie rolled her eyes dramatically. "I have my ways. I know how to hold a brush." At the shop, Garrett had prepared everything. Drop cloths on the floor, ladders, paint trays, and rollers. The walls, already sanded and primed, awaited their final color. "You'll take the lower parts," Garrett instructed Ellie, handing her a brush. "Calvin can supervise us and I'll handle the top." "And who supervises you?" Ellie asked with a playful grin. "All of us," Calvin replied, showing a rare moment of lightness. Painting the shop felt almost festive. Garrett brought a small radio that played old songs, the same ones Calvin used to listen to while working decades ago. Ellie painted with intense concentration, tongue sticking out when she tackled a tricky spot. Calvin alternated between giving pointers and trying a few steps without his cane, testing his limits. "Look, Calvin," Ellie called after a few hours. "I finished my whole section without messing anything up." Calvin examined the girl's work, surprisingly neat for someone her age. "Professional job," he praised, and she beamed with pride. Over the following days, the painting progressed. The exact same shade of blue the shop had always been gave a strange sense of continuity amidst all the changes. It was as if the place's essence remained, despite the renovation. One afternoon, as Garrett finished painting the exterior, he saw in the window's reflection Calvin practicing his steps inside. 1, 2, 3 steps without the cane. On the 4th, he stumbled, reaching out to steady himself against the freshly painted wall. Garrett was about to go in and help when Ellie quickly wheeled over, offering her shoulder as support. "I got this," Garrett heard her say. "Just don't rush." Calvin nodded, resting lightly on the girl's shoulder as he regained balance. For a moment, they formed a quietly poetic image, an elderly man and a child in a wheelchair, each compensating for the other's frailty. Garrett stayed where he was, silently witnessing that exchange. He felt something expand in his chest, not just admiration or fondness, but a deeper understanding of how life brings unlikely people together in moments of vulnerability. Finally, after nearly 2 months of hard work, the shop was ready. The space was completely transformed, modern, safe, efficient, yet it still retained the character Calvin had built over decades. At the back now lay a small, comfortable apartment, replacing the cramped room where Calvin had lived for so many years. It had a proper bedroom, a full accessible bathroom, and a functional kitchen. A second, smaller bedroom remained unfurnished for now. Everyone knew it was for Ellie, should she need or want to stay, though no one said it out loud. Only one detail remained, the shop's sign. The old, faded, cracked one had been taken down during the renovation. "I have something to show you," Garrett said one morning, bringing in a large wooden crate. Carefully, he opened it and revealed a new sign. "Calvin's workshop will be fixed what's still worth it." Calvin stood still, looking at the words, especially the tagline. The irony wasn't lost on him. A workshop that fixed broken objects, a family trying to fix broken relationships. His eyes brimmed, and for a moment it seemed he might speak, but no words came. "It's perfect," he finally said, voice thick with emotion. For the grand opening, they planned something simple, just hanging the sign and a small snack to celebrate. To everyone's surprise, Nora accepted the invitation to attend. Since their talk in her garden, she and Calvin had met several times, always in neutral spaces, always cautiously. "It'll be nice to see the shop renovated," she said over the phone when Garrett invited her. "I always thought that place had potential." The day of the opening dawned clear and crisp. Calvin was visibly nervous, fiddling with the clean shirt he'd picked out. Ellie arrived early, wearing a blue dress matching the shop's new color. "I matched on purpose," she explained proudly, spinning around to show off the effect. Garrett arrived with Nora, who carried a covered basket. "Mini pies," she explained. "Thought you might like them," she added, glancing briefly at Calvin. It was the first time she openly acknowledged a shared detail from their past, a small gesture that didn't go unnoticed. The unveiling ceremony was brief and straightforward. Calvin leaning on his cane but standing more steadily than he had in months, and Garrett revealed the new sign together, while Ellie clapped enthusiastically. A few old customers came by, as well as some neighbors curious about the transformation. Later, when most of the visitors had gone, Calvin, Garrett, Ellie, and Nora sat around a makeshift table in the newly reopened shop. The aroma of freshly heated mini pies mingled with the smell of fresh paint. Conversation flowed surprisingly easily about Ellie's school, about the possibility of Calvin teaching neighborhood kids mechanics, about an art exhibit Nora was organizing. There were still awkward silences, topics carefully avoided, but there was also laughter that occasionally surprised them by how natural it felt. Ellie broke the mood by pulling out a colorful package from her backpack. "I made you a present, Calvin," she announced, pushing the package toward him. Calvin opened it gently. Inside was a mechanic's creeper, the kind you use to slide under cars, but this one was hand-painted by Ellie with bright colors and drawings of tools, cars, and 3 stick figures representing Calvin, Garrett, and Ellie. "So you won't forget you're not alone anymore," she said with the unfiltered sincerity of a child. Silence filled the room, but not the heavy silence of old. It was a silence full of emotions too big for words. Calvin placed the creeper on the floor and tried it on, making Ellie giggle and, to everyone's surprise, eliciting a genuine laugh from Nora as well. Soon, they were all laughing, the sound echoing off the freshly painted walls of the shop. "You look like an astronaut," Garrett joked, reaching for another mini pie. "A very old astronaut," Calvin added, prompting more laughter. As the afternoon wore on, Garrett observed the scene with a sense of unreality. This unlikely family, an elderly father rediscovering life, a mother who had carried her pain alone for decades, a child who arrived by chance and gave them all a new perspective, and himself, still reconciling past resentments with present possibilities. Nora and Calvin were now chatting about the old cars he used to fix for her many years ago. There was no romance or excessive nostalgia, just a calm acknowledgement of a shared past that, despite the pain, also held moments of value. Ellie listened, fascinated, occasionally asking questions that made the adults smile. Her fresh perspective, free of tangled history, reminded them that the present and the future could differ from the past. It wasn't perfect. The harmony was new, sometimes fragile. There were uneasy silences and lingering painful memories. Occasionally, a word or gesture opened an old wound, like a cut still healing that hurt when touched. But it was real. It was a new beginning, and beginning again, Garrett now understood, didn't mean erasing what happened. It didn't mean pretending the wounds never existed or the pain wasn't real. Beginning again was simply choosing to continue the story, this time with more honesty, more understanding, and a kindness that only emerges after many hard years. On the freshly painted wall of the shop, the shadow of the new sign stood out like a promise. "We fix what's still worth it." And maybe, Garrett thought, watching these people gathered around the table, that was the most important truth they'd learned. That despite all the cracks, breaks, and damage, what they had, this unlikely family, this rebuilding of connections, was still worth fixing. Grown-ups think kids don't understand important things. That's funny because we do understand them, just in a different way. "My name is Ellie. I have a blue wheelchair. Well, actually now I have 2. The old one Calvin fixed when we first met, and the new, modern one Garrett gave me. I use both. The new one for school and going around, the old one for the shop, because it's okay if it gets grease on it. Before I met Calvin, I thought the world was split into 2 types of people, those who leave and those who stay. My parents were the first type. I don't remember much about them, just flashes like faded photos. The foster families too. No one stayed very long. Then my wheel broke on that sidewalk, right in front of the shop with the peeling sign, and everything changed. You know that feeling when you arrive somewhere and instantly feel at home, even though you've never been there before? That's what it was like with the shop, the smell of oil and metal, the sound of the tools. Calvin eyeing my chair like it was some interesting puzzle. "I can fix that," he said, and he wasn't just talking about the wheel. At first, it was just me stopping by after school. I'd sit in a corner doing homework while Calvin worked on cars. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it mattered. Things like, almost anything can be fixed if you're patient, or having the right tools makes all the difference. He never asked why I was always alone, or why sometimes I showed up wearing the same clothes as the day before. I guess he knew without asking. Broken people recognize other broken people. One night, it rained so hard that the shelter I was in flooded. I went to the shop because I had nowhere else to go. Calvin opened the door, looked at me all soaked, and just said, "There's soup on the stove." I stayed that night. Then another, and another, until leaving stopped making sense. That's when he started telling me about Garrett. Not all at once, but in bits and pieces, between an oil change and a radiator repair. How much he missed him, how sorry he was, how he saved every newspaper clipping he could find. "He probably hates you," I said once, too direct, the way only kids can be. Calvin didn't get mad, he just looked far away at something I couldn't see and said, "Probably. And he has every right. Grown-ups think they have to hide sadness from kids, as if we can't recognize it, but Calvin never hid it. I think that's why I trusted him from the start. He was real, broken, sad sometimes, but real." Then one day, Garrett showed up at the shop. I knew who he was before he said a word. He had Calvin's eyes, that impossible blue. But his eyes were walled up with hurt. You could see the anger pouring off him like heat from an overheated engine. That day wasn't pretty. Hard words were said. Old wounds tore open. Calvin looked so small after Garrett left. He sat on that shop stool and didn't say a thing for hours. "He'll come back," I said, without being sure. Calvin gave me a sad smile. "Some things can't be fixed, Ellie." "Everything can be fixed," I insisted. "You taught me that." I guess that was the moment I decided to help. Not because it was my job, but because when you find a place to call home, you do what you can to protect it. Then Calvin had the heart attack. I've never been so scared in my life. He was on the floor of the shop, clutching his chest and face pale. I remember pushing my chair so fast down the streets my hands were raw. I remember yelling in the huge lobby where Garrett worked. The look in his eyes when he recognized not who I was, but what was happening. Sometimes it takes something terrible to fix what seems impossible. While Calvin was in the hospital, I saw Garrett change. At first, he was distant, cold, doing just the basics. Then he started asking questions about the shop, about me, about how Calvin lived. I caught him once looking at the clippings, the ones about his career that Calvin collected. His hands were shaking. "He saved all of this," Garrett said, almost to himself. "He never gave up on you," I replied. "He just didn't know how to come back." The shop renovation was like watching a story get rewritten, brick by brick, wall by wall, Garrett and Calvin, side by side, rebuilding not just the place, but whatever was between them. It wasn't always smooth. There were arguments, tense silences, moments it looked like everything would collapse. But there was also the first time Garrett called Calvin Dad without noticing. The day Calvin took his first steps without the cane, with Garrett close by to steady him. The night we told funny stories and laughed together, way past bedtime. And then Nora came. The first time was awkward, everyone tiptoeing around, so careful with words that we barely talked at all. But she returned, and again, each visit, the words flowed a bit easier, the laughter coming more naturally. It's funny how people can be family without realizing it, how they can build something new from broken pieces. In school, they teach that a family is people connected by blood or paperwork. But I've learned that family is more than that. It's who stays when leaving would be easier. It's who fixes things when throwing them away would be simpler. Now the shop looks better than ever. Calvin teaches mechanics to neighborhood teens on Saturday afternoons. Garrett comes for dinner 3 times a week. Nora brings fresh flowers every time she visits, and I have my own room, with the walls painted in a color I chose. People ask how we ended up together. This odd family of an elderly mechanic, a businessman, an art curator, and a girl in a wheelchair. I say it was an accident, literally, a broken wheel on the right sidewalk. But maybe there are no accidents. Maybe it's just people looking for other people to build a home with. I could say a lot about forgiveness, new beginnings, and repairs, but I'll tell you the most important thing I've learned from watching Calvin wait for Garrett all those years, saving clippings and memories. While you were gone, we didn't give up. We waited. And you came back. And that's enough. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.